Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on taking your visuals to the next level. I'm Erin Elsie, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Tiffany Davis. Tiffany is a professional librarian and has worked in libraries for over 10 years. She has presented in various formats in the last few years and always enjoys attending presentations. Tiffany is also very active with the Missouri Library Association. She was an active instructor when the association hosted a blended online in-person presentation academy to help other librarians become comfortable with submitting presentation proposals, as well as sharpening their presentation skills. Tiffany brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have her with us. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for Tiffany, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here's Tiffany. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Thank you so much for a great intro, and thank you everyone for spending your time out of your day to talk about taking your visuals to the next level. As Erin mentioned before, this all started when a group of us at Missouri Library Association were talking about why we don't see other people presenting and hesitations in presenting, and a lot of people had questions on how they should put in proposals and they were just not comfortable with it. So a group of us got together and we decided that we could, with our small collective knowledge, kind of pass off what we knew. And so that's when we started the Presentation Academy. And this was a blended in-person and in webinar form, different topics about how to write the proposal to get in, and then once you're accepted, what to do. And one of the things a lot of people in the group mentioned that they weren't comfortable with were the visuals, either the PowerPoint or making the poster for the poster session. And I was like, well, I can give it a stab. I have a background in photography, so I do know a little bit about design, and that I could do a little research and see what we came up with. And I ended up doing the presentation there, and somebody approached me and was like, hey, would you mind doing it here? And I was like, not a problem. So it's great to know that the word's going out, and it's very, very helpful, and just good information to have. So this is me. As I mentioned, I'm a working professional librarian in a public library. And I have, in the last couple of years, have presented in various subjects, either on doing webcasts or in this capacity of visuals. So I'm not 100% new to it, but it's been a while since I've done one, so I'm a little rusty, so bear with me. So why is it important that your visuals look good? And mostly it's because we live in a visual world. We are bombarded with tons of advertisements, social media, lots of stuff that we're constantly sifting through and looking at it. And because of that, we are more attuned to what looks good and what doesn't look good. And we've all been in presentations where the visuals aren't that great, or you're looking at a poster and you're really trying to figure out what's going on and you're not 100% sure. And these tend to take away from the presentation. And when you're presenting, you don't want that to happen to you. You don't want your visuals to steal your thunder. You're definitely the one there to put your knowledge forward, especially when you're speaking and using a PowerPoint as a backup. Today I'm going to cover two types of visuals, the PowerPoint and posters. The PowerPoint they're kind of similar but very different. When you're using a PowerPoint, you're definitely the main person, and it's kind of your backup. You don't want people to just look at the PowerPoint and not listen or look at what you're saying, because that's taking away from you. I like to think of the PowerPoint as your backup dancer, and you're the lead vocalist. You don't want it to outshine you, but you definitely want to be front and center. The poster is a little different because you want the poster to stand on its own. You're not always going to be there to talk about the poster, and to explain what's going on in it. So you want the people coming up, and when they're looking at it, they can easily read it, see where you're coming from on your situation and how you resolved it, and not need further explanation, really. So they're very different, yet some of the design elements can work with both of them. So we'll go ahead and first start talking about PowerPoint, because a lot of times when you think of presenting, this is the first thing you think of. And I'll mention a lot going through that less is more, and editing, which we've all heard this in different capacities, but definitely with visuals, you don't want to add too much. Also to consistency, making sure if you're picking a color theme or you're picking a certain kind of font or text, making sure it's consistent throughout the entire presentation and you're not moving around or changing things up. Also, another key thing is your slides aren't necessarily your notes. A lot of people tend to write everything they want to on the slide, thinking that this is the main way to convey a point to everyone, but it shouldn't be. You should only have one thought on a slide, and you really want to put in the 3-second rule, where you can take 3 seconds, read the slide, know what the slide's about, and then go back to you. The minute people start reading your slide, they start turning off what you're saying, and they can't hear what you're saying because they're too busy reading the slide. The longer it takes them to read the slide and understand what the slide's about, the more time it's taking away from you and your message, and you don't want that. The slide is, like I said, a backup to you, so it should be the main topic, and then you're explaining more about the topic. There's also the 10, 20, 30 method, 10 slides, 20 minutes, 30 font. This is definitely the less is more. You don't necessarily need to fit all of your thoughts on individual slides, and then you have lots and lots of slides, because at that point you're just thumbing through them as you're speaking. You really want the slide to almost kind of be a background to what you're saying and not like an accompaniment to as you're saying it. And then another thing that I've come up with, and it's come up in a lot of research, are logos in slides. A lot of times you want to put your affiliation on the slide, but you don't necessarily need to put it on every single slide. And I was reading through a funny comment, and they were like, well, if you're 20 slides in and the person still doesn't know who you are or why you're talking about it, then obviously things are going wrong. And I never really thought of it that way. But when I've done a lot more research and even looking the way different slides are set up, it does realize that that is one more thing that you have to look at when you're looking at the slide, and that's one more second that's being taken away from the presenter. So we'll go ahead and talk a little more about it. I'm going to mention Prezi. So it was really popular about a couple years ago. It kind of came on the scene and was really popular, and everyone really liked it. I personally find it a little distracting, mostly because of the transitions. If you're not familiar with it, it's an online presentation software that has transitions that kind of zoom in and zoom out, and allows you to put in your text, but it has all the visuals done where it's a larger picture, and then you zoom in, and then you zoom out, and then you zoom in to other things. This is definitely where less is more if you're going to use a Prezi. The more zooming in and zooming out is more of a distraction from what you're saying. So the people will be more focused on that, and especially if you tend to have something that's a little more slide heavy, that you have to have more slides in it. You definitely don't want to have to be toggling through these, and everyone in the audience is bouncing back and forth to what, and trying to pretty much keep up with the visual as you're speaking, because at that point they've quit listening to you. So I say that it's very interesting visually, but definitely less is more for it. You definitely don't want to go overboard with it, which leads in to my next slide. There was a kind of nifty transition over there, and that's something too that you definitely want to only use transitions when they help. If it all of a sudden changes into little squares and then it reappears, disappears, and reappears, people are going to watch that instead of listening to what you're saying, and they're going to be like, oh, that's kind of neat, and then they will totally think of something completely different than what you're actually talking about. So as this slide we see here is a little all over the place. Boring generic title, bullet points, words in different colors, words in different sizes, words in different everything. This is really, really distracting, and mostly because of the busy background. There are some pre-made templates in PowerPoint that have these nifty kind of backgrounds, but you definitely want to make sure your background is easy to read when your text is on it, and definitely easy to read from really, really far away. So obviously, the larger the font on it, the easier it is to read. Here, there's some that are blending in too much with the slide. Some of them are way, brighter, but the contrast is too hard to read, and then sometimes they're just too small. So think about if the person's way, way in the back, they can't see what's on your slide at all, and they're going to spend more time trying to figure out what is on the slide, what could be on the slide, and not listening to you say what is on the slide. So that's a good example of definitely what not to do. And here's a couple more examples, and we'll touch on a few other things. So we got a lot of clip art going on. We have a title. It's kind of hard to read. We have the busy background. We have our bullet points, which bullet points are hit or miss. Some people really like them. Some people find them easier to read. Some people don't necessarily need them. But you definitely don't want to have a lot of them, because then when people view it like this list, they know they have to look at each individual item and see which is on this list. And like I said, the more the people have to take to process the slide that they're looking at, the less time they're listening to you. So when you look at this one, you see the 3 clip art pictures, so you're like, oh, that's art supplies, title, then list. And that, even though it's only a few seconds, people have to process that, and then they start listening to what you're saying again. So here is a different view of the similar slide. So we just have the one picture, which is actually a stock photo as opposed to clip art, which I find a little more visually appealing. Then we have a larger font, which is the art supplies needed, and then a smaller size with the list without the bullet points. And it ends up being a little easier to read. You look at it, you can definitely tell this is about art supplies. That's what the list that I need. The less time it takes people, like I said before, for them to figure it out, the more time they switch back on to listening to you. So as you can see, the fonts, we can go ahead and talk about those. And this is what I found the most interesting in doing some of the research, was about fonts and why certain fonts are easier to read. And everyone has an opinion on fonts. It's kind of a funny topic, but really there's 2 types of fonts. You have your serif fonts and your sans serif fonts. And New Times Roman, which is the standard font for everything, is a serif font. And what that means is it has these little feet, and you can see them on the N and you can see them on the T, and they're on all the bottoms of everything. And that's what they call these little feet. And what they found out is that New Times Roman is really easy to read when there's a lot of text. And that's why it's mostly in books and obviously in newspapers. It's in very text heavy. And that's why they really haven't changed this, because studies have shown that the feet make it easier for you to understand what it is and then process it and read faster, especially when there's a lot of it. So then that makes you wonder, well, why would you ever use a sans serif font? Well, the studies have shown kind of the opposite. Without having the feet, it's easier to read these fonts when it's shorter sentences, or like in advertising and logos, in headings and things like that. They found that these are much faster to people to glance at, see what it says, and then continue on. So that's why you're going to see a lot more sans serif fonts in advertising than you're going to see as far as New Times Roman. And that is a personal preference. I think, the New Times Roman looks just as good as the Arial font. And then a lot of times people ask about mixing fonts. And then this is where I tend to err on the side of caution. I personally like everything in the same font family. But sometimes they do say putting a heading in an Arial font and then lots of text in the New Times font is very helpful. And I could see this being helpful in posters, especially if you're doing an academic poster where you do have a lot of text in there and you do have a lot of information that you're having to put on it, that could be helpful as a breaking it up, especially visually. People can see the change in the font. You can tell the font in the top is different than the middle than to the end. And when you see these changes, you visually break them up and you know that it's changing into something else. So this can be an easy cue that you can put in later on to help people. But anytime you are choosing your font, especially with PowerPoint, making sure that it's consistent throughout the entire presentation. You don't want sometimes your headings are in New Times and sometimes they're in Arial, because those little changes, like I said, people pick up on that. And even though it takes just microseconds to figure it out, it's sometimes they'll be like, well, why was it like this in the previous one and it's not like this in this one? So one of the other things that really do influence your visuals are color. And sometimes this is the hardest one to nail down because it's really sometimes preference and what you want. And it's really important because since we do live in such a visual world, color has a lot to do with it, as far as definitely in advertising and the way things are marketed to us. And they have tons of studies have done on what different colors originate different feelings in people when they're viewed. Cooler shades tend to have more calming and relaxing. Warmer shades have a tendency to be more active. That's why they always say, like in fast food companies, a lot of times their colors in their restaurants are warm colors and red, because it tends to make people hungry and leave. As opposed to sometimes other places are cooler tones, you tend to want to stay there longer. So with that being said, this is a great website, sessions.edu. It has a color calculator. And if you're like me, you're not 100% sure like what colors really go well with each other and what hues complement each other. That's a great website. You should definitely take a look at it. You can put in a certain color that you're thinking of, and it'll give you complementary colors, and it'll give you some advice on how the colors work out. I found it really, really informative. As you can see in the color wheel, this gives you kind of idea. I mean, we have our primary colors and then we have our secondary colors. But then across from the wheel is what they give us, our complementary colors. And this is what's saying that they look good together or is a good contrast in each other if you're wanting to get something to pop. Another really popular trend is monochromatic colors. So say you take this red violet and you really like that, but then taking different shades of that and incorporating that. So you could have a lighter background with a darker title in it, and then having a secondary color as the text. Or if you're doing a poster, you can have your main colors, but then to break up different sections, you can go into a different value of the same color. So visually, it's very similar as far as color, but you can definitely tell that you're going into a different section visually. So I found that very interesting. You definitely should take a look at it when you have time. And then here are some examples, because the number one thing a lot of people ask and is, should you put a dark color on a light background or a light color on a dark background? And a lot of it's hard to say. It's kind of personal preference when I'm doing a this is what you do and don't do on a lot of things that are personal preference and what people like. But this, I thought, was a good example of sometimes yes and sometimes no. The top box, which is really bright yellow, and it has a really bright blue color, which would definitely be their complementary colors. But this yellow is like retina burning. If you went through 20 slides of this, you would totally be done. You would claw your eyes out. You would definitely have no idea what was happening by the end of it. It's just really, really bright. However, that blue on there really pops. But if you were to just take it a little bit shades down from each other and make it a little more of a muted yellow and a lighter blue, then you can definitely see the contrast is easier on the eyes and it's easier to read. And that's one of the things you definitely want to think about when you're picking out the color, is making sure that it's easy to read and that the person way in the back isn't trying to figure out what's going on, or it's not blinding them in the face. So sometimes just taking the hue down a little bit or making it not as bright definitely helps out. Keeping the same color palette, but it's just not as bold. And the same thing here with the blue next to it. That blue is really, really deep, and that yellow, which is the same color as the yellow in the other box, is just really bright. And it's so, so bright. But then if we tone it down a little bit, it definitely gives a much more complementary, cleaner look too. Even though there's similar colors, they're just different shades of the same color. And then this also goes into the factor, and we probably have all seen this on the internet, where they're like, what colors are these two colors really the same? And they end up being the same, but they look different because of whatever shade of color they're behind or in front of. And it's pretty much the same. I feel like the yellow on the background is way more yellow than the yellow that's on the bright blue box, but they're actually the same color of yellow. It's just the context that it's in and what it's against. So keep that in mind too when you're picking your colors, that sometimes they're exacerbated by the color they're next to. Like they're just really bright and they're really bold because you're picking another really bright and bold color. But if you tone them down a little bit, it can really bring them out to make them look really, really nice. So sometimes when you're giving a presentation, you have an abstract concept, and this is most of the time when you're doing presentations. You're coming up with some kind of concept or workflow, and it's really hard to make a visual out of that without just doing the bullet points, because you don't want like 20 slides of bullet points everywhere. Because like I said, they can get boring and people tend to read them, and the more they read, the more they cut off. And one of the great things that I found in PowerPoint that I really, really like are what they call smart objects. And these are kind of nifty because they give you a more visual appearance to abstract concepts. So like this one I'm using, and I've used for a previous presentation, is on the reference interview process. It's a process, but it's not, instead of just putting it in bullet points, it's sometimes nice to have a visual aid that kind of just spices it up a little bit. So these are, when you go in, you can set up a smart object, you can put your text into it. And another key thing that I really like about these is you can export just a single slide or all the slides in PowerPoint as JPEGs. So you could, in essence, drop this into something else. So if you made a smart object and you really like it, you could drop it into a poster later on if you want to accompany what your PowerPoint looked like, or if you wanted to later on put it in any kind of teaching materials or things like that. They come in various ways. These are all kind of more steps to a certain approach, but sometimes they have gears, sometimes they have triangle effects. So they do have quite a bit for a lot of different concepts. So I definitely would suggest taking a look at those and kind of playing around with those. They really do add a little spice to your PowerPoint on something that otherwise would just be bullet points, but it does make it a little easier to read and visually a little more active. So all in all, wrapping up on the PowerPoint end of it, the main keys are keeping it simple, consistency, and just making it easy to read, but not too distracting. And then you can also, when you make one up, definitely have a friend take a look at it. I also like to know that sometimes the PowerPoints are nice for people to have an idea of what's going on, but they shouldn't be able to completely figure out all of your entire presentation and everything that you're going to say. And because that really takes away from your thunder. As I said, it should definitely be a backup dancer in your presentation, because if the person's spending time reading the PowerPoint slide and then they start listening to you, they could just read it all. And the idea is that they want to be spending all their time listening to you and what you're saying, because you're the one that has the good information and you're the one that experienced it. And you definitely want to share that with everyone. So we'll go ahead now and switch over onto posters. So posters, like I said, are a little bit different than PowerPoints because they kind of do the exact opposite. They need to stand on their own. They definitely need to be able to be read on their own. A lot of times you go there, you have your time, which you kind of explain your poster and are there to answer questions about your poster. But sometimes afterwards, when you're not there, people will come through, and you definitely want to have them be able to see and read your poster and walk away knowing what they need to know. And if they have other questions, they can contact you. Because the last thing you want is somebody to walk by and just be like, oh, okay, whatever, and then walk on. Because you definitely want to get your message out there. The one key thing I would definitely tell everyone is when you're applying for your poster, and if you do get accepted for your poster, definitely check your standards and sizes of what your poster should be. I've gone to some where everyone's poster is the same size, and then 2 or 3 people's posters are just a little bit different, or they're way smaller than everyone else's. And sometimes, I mean, it definitely draws attention, but sometimes it just looks a little different. And so you want to definitely make sure that if you're applying for certain presentations, that there aren't specific size formats you need to keep in mind, because this can definitely affect how your poster looks. If you just need a small poster for like a easel, which could be anything like an 8x20 or something like that, or if you need a larger poster similar to how research posters are done, where it's much, much bigger and you have multiple columns, that definitely changes the way you're going to format things, and it's going to change the way you deliver your information. So we'll go ahead and look. This one is my favorite example of a very intense poster. It's got a lot going on. After you read it, it kind of makes sense, but there's a ton going on. We have logos in the corner. We have the little guinea pig on the weight station. We definitely don't know necessarily where you should be going and what you should be reading first and what's going on. And you don't necessarily want that in your poster. You want people to be able to distinctively have a start and a finish to where they're reading and where they're going. And so I went ahead and made this slide because it gives you an idea of a basic somebody should read through your poster. You want to be able to, because we always tend to start in the top corner, and we want to be able to direct the person's eyes to the appropriate flow of your poster for them to read. And as I said, this is where a lot of color can come in, a lot of font can come in, and really direct people's eyes to where they need to go. Because if you start with your methods and you end in your abstract, then no one's going to realize where we're going with this and why did we do what we did. So you definitely want to make sure you're putting the right information in the right spots, but you're definitely making their eye follow to the next area. Because anytime people start to get lost, then they start to lose interest. And you don't want them to lose interest because you spent a lot of time on this, and you definitely want to make sure that they are able to read it and get the message and not get lost in something as simple as the way it's laid out, format, or color. So here's an example of one I really, really liked. They did for an ALA a while back, and it's very easy to read. The logo, the top title is super easy to read. You can definitely tell what it's about. You know what you're going to read. You can start reading the sections. It pretty much follows your line, can go up and about. We do have some charts and graphs and some visuals. I don't think they take away too much. I think they really add to what's going on, because normally, especially if it's on a topic that somebody's not really, really into, they may not want to spend 5 minutes reading your poster. They may actually only glance at it. And you definitely want to make sure that even if they do glance at it, they're really getting the gist of what you have to say. Even though in some of them, the more academic ones, you do have to talk more about your model methods and your outcomes, but you want it also to be fairly easy to read, that they, even if they just read bits of it, they could pretty much figure out what happened, that this is what started, this was the problem, this was how you solved it, these are your conclusions. And that's really what most people want, is to figure out what the issue was, how you solved it, and if that's something they can apply to themselves. So with all that being said, you probably wonder, like, how do you do this? Well, I was in my digging around in my research, I found that there are some really neat PowerPoint templates that you can use for in PowerPoint to help you outline, especially in research style papers. And they have them in all different sizes. So once you figure out what your size is that you need, you can go ahead and start looking through some of the templates. Now you can, what I would advise, they're all usually this kind of bluey color or greeny color, but definitely kind of play with the color and find out what reflects what you're doing. If you're working with a certain institution and you want to reflect the institution's colors, that's always nice. Or if you want to add a little pizzazz and do something a little monochromatic, you can always do that. So they do have that. I find that that's especially helpful. I know a lot of institutions have print shops that will help you print, and sometimes they have their own sizes and templates there. It seems a little daunting at first when you're looking at it because you're like, oh my gosh, I've never done anything like this. It has all these things I got to write up and put in there. But it is kind of fun once you start playing around with it. And I would definitely do a couple test prints on a smaller scale and ask what people think of it and see if they can read it, especially people who don't necessarily know what you're talking about really well. Because if they don't know and they can still get the gist of it, that means you did a really good job. Because especially if they don't have any background in it, transferring this knowledge to people is hard, especially when you assume that they come with a lot of know-how already when they're viewing it, and sometimes they don't. And that's some of the fun part about going to conferences and presentations is learning something you have no idea what it is, and then coming back and being like, oh, that's really interesting, that's really great. I'm glad I took some time to figure out more about it. So this is an example of doing some complementary colors, toning them down a little bit and not being as bright as our main colors, and then also doing some shades. So as you can tell, we have the teal, which is the darker color on top of this kind of lighter orangey tan color. But then the smaller boxes are actually a lighter shade of that darker teal, and then we have a black text on the kind of tanny color. And this is another example of just using those shades of color and directing your eye and seeing how they can change. You can also play with the fonts. You know, we have a sans serif font at the top, and then we have a serif font for the text. And sometimes playing around with that and seeing what looks good and what doesn't look good. And don't be afraid to try some things and see what really works out. And then try getting some people's opinion. They could be like, no, I don't, that Arial font in the top is just way too hard to read. I am having a really hard time figuring out what this is. Because then you can always move some things around and then change it before you go out and really do your big test run. Because you definitely want people to be able to read it and get your message. And you don't want them to be hung up on it. Sometimes you'll be there to tell them, but like I said, this one needs to stand on its own, and you're more of a backup dancer to it later on. So you definitely want it to stay on its own and be able to pass on your message. So another interesting concept, and can be a little fun, is if you necessarily don't have to do like a research style poster, you could do a smaller poster or a different kind of poster. You could really play along with infographics or some of the online poster software. And these are kind of fun. I did this one in PictoChart as a simple this summer reading club at your library. And these two you could use depending on your institution. You could use these for progress of checking out, number of interlibrary loans, summer reading club, all kinds of different things which staff love to look at and think are great. And it's also great for when you're doing posters too. And people can come by and get an idea of what it was, what went on, and your outcomes too. And it just kind of puts it in a little more fun visual light as opposed to the standard text-heavy posters like research posters. Another online poster service I personally like is Canva. So it was a long time ago when we first did this, almost a year ago, we did this presentation. This didn't really have a lot of interesting stuff. It was more just one big picture and a little bit of text. But then later on when I was looking over it again for this one, it really did have a lot more features. And some of the features I personally like is they do have abilities to do social media posts, which can be helpful if you're running your own social media, so you can have that post look similar to your poster session. You could also have that if you wanted to push out social media content to your institution. But the posters definitely have gotten a lot better. This one's kind of a blank, blank template that you can drop your information in. I just made it about, libraries and some fake text, but you could put your challenges and your outcomes and then how you solve them. And if you're walking around in a room with lots of posters, this is pretty easy to read. You can get a good idea of what it is. Pretty simple. You can even plug in your own photos for examples. And they have tons of different templates like this that you can really play around and move things around and see what works. And it's nice because the colors are kind of already made for you, so you don't necessarily have to think a lot about that. The fonts are already picked out. And you can even tell here we have some sans serif fonts as titles, and then we have some serif fonts as the text. And that was already done. That's how they had it pre-set up. I didn't even mess with that part. This is another one that I did just in Canva to give you guys an idea of what they can look like. And then, this really depending on what your subject is, you can add different images to it. You can change things around, but they do have lots of great templates, and I really like that one. Now, they do have a paid versions, of course, for more add-ons to your posters or to your social media posts, but they do have a large selection of the free stuff, which I like. Infogram is another one that you can do different infographic style things. Now, they do have some templates that are free. I think I'm going to say that one. I'm remembering that you do have to pay for certain exporting options. And that's one of the things with these, you do have to watch as far as making sure it's a higher quality so you can export it if you definitely need to blow it up. But a lot of there's a lot of the poster services, the web-based ones, do have a lot of basic templates versus paid templates. But it really depends on what you're doing. If you're doing something, at a much national level and you definitely want to spend some more money on it, then that's fine. Or if you're just doing a small poster locally at one of your community interests or something, then you maybe don't necessarily need to spend all for the bells and whistles, and you can just do something smaller. But it does give a lot of that graphic element without necessarily having to make a ton of text boxes and moving things around and trying to figure out which colors go well with each other. It kind of does a lot of that work for you. So those are always options that you can explore too. And with that being said, some of the main things as far as posters is just really keeping consistent and keeping the same color palette. So if you're 1.5 year poster, you have certain fonts, you just want to make sure all your titles are in the same fonts, all your text is in the same fonts, and things like that. So that concludes my presentation, and I know it's kind of an odd topic, and there isn't a lot you can really go up. Some of this you can go on and forever about, especially fonts and colors, but I definitely don't want to bore you guys on that, and I definitely want to make sure we have time for questions if anyone has any.
All right, thank you, Tiffany. That was a really great session. As Tiffany mentioned, we now have time for questions. So if you have not yet done so, please type your questions into the question box. And we do have a couple in there so far. And one is, what was the software used on the previous slide? And I think that if we could just run through the 3 tools you mentioned when you talked about the infographics section, that would be helpful.
Yeah, this one was made with PictoChart. That one has the images preloaded into it. You kind of pick a pre-done one, and then you bring it over, you open it up, you can change all the text in it, and then you can kind of change things out. Like I was able to change out the popsicle at the top and then put my own words on the banner. And then I was able to kind of pick from their own clip art per se, the bottom parts where it's like DVDs, ebooks. I was able to pick those out and plop them into pre-set up places, and then changing the text. And I do think with the paid version, you can have it without the little logo at the bottom. I think with the unpaid version, they put the little logo on there. And then these two, this one and the green one, that's done with Canva. Yeah, in my notes I have it, so I can spell these out for you guys so they're not. So Canva is canva.com. and then it's P-I-T, make sure I get to the other one. Yeah, PIKTOCHART.com. And there's a couple other ones out there, like info, like I said, INFOGRAM.com. That's another one I've used in the past, but I was kind of not thrilled about them having restrictions on what you can export out as far as like JPEGs and PDFs and stuff like that. So I haven't used that one, but they might have changed that. It's been a while since I've used that one.
All right, thank you. We have an LIS instructor who assigns creating a poster to their students, and they're always asking for examples. Do you have any source that you could recommend them to go to for examples of good posters?
That's a great question. I wish there was like a great one, because when I was doing this previously, we had tons of examples, and a lot of them was just searching online, and then searching Pinterest, like great poster sessions. Great. Some of them are like great. I did ALA poster sessions, and a lot of times you can definitely tell, like first seeing it, you're like, oh, that's really good. Then I kind of read through the content and make sure it kind of makes sense. Unfortunately, the problem with some of the posters is unless the person who's done the poster doesn't really publish it anywhere else, or they don't really put out their digital files, most of the time they have them, they print them, they hang them up, they take them down, and then they're done. Though when I did it for MLA a couple months ago, I think I did take some photos of the last ALA I went to and some of the poster sessions that were there to give them an idea, since I was already going, kind of do double duty. But it is hard. It is hard to find some pictures of good ones. I ended up also finding some posters, not necessarily of library poster sessions, but of various different disciplines that had really good ones. There was one that I really liked that was done by a marketing student, and it was a little more on the infography side, but it was really definitely a poster. Like it did have text, and it had all the parts as far as abstracts and conclusions and variables, and it was really nicely done. So sometimes looking outside of the discipline is helpful. Unfortunately, it's like you're teaching it now, but a lot of times the students do it, you do it, it turns out okay, but then, halfway down your career, then you're like, oh, I have something really cool I want to share to somebody, and then you're like, well, what do I do? How do I do that? It's been so long since I ever did one, and what does it need to look like? So it can be kind of hard, especially if you haven't done one in a while.
Okay, thank you. So we have a little bit of a long question now. So sometimes slides are distributed following a webinar and are the only thing people will have about the webinar to reference. How do you balance making the slides useful after the presentation when they don't have a recording and not including everything in the slides? Or should you just not worry about it and not expect the slides to stand alone?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question, because there are a lot of people who definitely like to look over the slides for reference later on. One of the things I didn't do it for this one, I did it for the previous one, is I also made a standalone sheet of links and things for people to look at and kind of the main topics, almost like an outline of my presentation for them to have later on. Because when I do most of my slides, I mean, if you looked at all this, you would have no idea of what I was talking about or what we were even doing. You'd probably get a chuckle off some memes, and then that would be it. And it really is personal preference. If you want to add more notes to the end of your slides, or if you want to add a secondary outline of what you talked about, you can. But mostly the thing is, it's not that your slides can't have all the same information. It's just you don't want people spending too much time reading them and taking away from you. So you definitely don't want to put all of, your main points and then all the bullet points on all of your slides, because really then you could just read it afterwards and not necessarily been there for your presentation. And that takes away from when you're presenting, and you just definitely don't want it to take away from when you're talking. I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. A question about fonts. Do you have any suggested fonts besides serif or non-serif? Because I know there's differences between how they display I's and L's or zeros and O's.
Yeah, And you know, that's kind of goes into everyone has an opinion on fonts, and sometimes it really is the look that you're going for that really dictates the font that you would use. And sometimes, like even the one we have here, we have some serif and not sans serif. They're all kind of all over the place, but somehow it reads kind of cohesively. Now looking at this, I probably would have made them all a little easier to read and probably all of the same font. So I'm definitely breaking my own rules on this one. But I think sometimes it really depends on what's easy to read. Like the font with the little people in the red, it's really close together. So it's sometimes a little harder to read than say the font below it. And both of those are sans serif fonts. So I think it really depends on what you're the look that you're going for. If you want it to be fairly easy to read, then you can always go for a sans serif font that's a little wider as far as the spacing, and usually that could be a wider Arial, maybe a bold Arial. There's quite a few. I can't remember all of them off the top of the head, and I honestly can't. I mean, if somebody just put a bunch of words on there, I couldn't necessarily tell you which one's which. There are font people who can, and they'll be like, oh, that's Arial 12. And I'm like, oh, okay. So it really depends a lot on your preference when you're doing it. And I always say I rather err on the side of easier to read than not easier to read when choosing a font.
All right, thank you. Do you have any books or guides or manuals you can suggest for people to reference if they're really interested in this?
Well, I know there's a lot of great articles on the fonts, especially as far as really breaking down the differences in them and what people like. Of course, there's lots of design books out there that talk about this, especially for like graphic designers and things like that. So it's one of those, like, you get your feet enough in the water to realize that you don't really know a lot. And then there's so much more to learn about. But I definitely would suggest in the previous slide about the color wheel, definitely checking out that website. That one has a lot of great information about how colors work with each other and what colors work well, and picking those colors when you're setting something up. And then also, I just did a little bit of different fonts, reading type, things like. You can really definitely go down the rabbit hole on it, but I don't have any specific suggestions.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions for choosing colors versus PowerPoint versus poster, or online versus poster, when you don't really have the opportunity to print it out before printing the final copy because they're fairly large and expensive? Do you have any good ideas on how to check how your color scheme will work in print?
Yeah, so what you'll definitely want to make sure, so there are different color schemes. This is taking me back to my photo days. There's different color schemes when you print out. Some will print out in RGB. Some will print out in specific color. The printer will have specific colors themes that it prints to. So when you go to your printer, you definitely want to make sure that the colors, asking what they print in, because that will give you an idea of making sure that your colors that you have on yours are correct, because that does happen a lot. Sometimes you'll set up your document to be RGB, but they're printing on a cyan, yellow, magenta color scheme. So those colors will shift when you get the final product. And this can be very important, because if you have colors that are similar to each other, or you really like the way a certain color lays on another, say your font on your boxes, you want to make sure that doesn't get washed out or look weird or anything like that. So I would definitely make sure when you talk to the printer that you're in the same color scheme when you go to export it, because then you can stay as true to those colors too. Also, you can ask them if there's any shifts in when they print their colors. So if they know sometimes things tend to be a little heavier on the magenta heavy, so things kind of have more of a cast to them, you can ask them about that too. And that can help with trying to make sure that this comes out the best it can without having your colors shift too much or get muddy.
All right, thank you. And then I think we have one more, and it's about trends. You'd mentioned there was a trend for monochromatic colors right now. Should we really adhere to trends, or should we be sticking to kind of like decades-long, tried and true standard ideas of how to design?
I mean, it really depends. So some places, I mean, some institutions, especially when you're presenting on behalf of them or something like that, they have a specifics on what they want it to look like. And definitely follow those. If they want it to have the institution's colors on it and you want it to be like that, or they want it in a certain format in a certain way, by all means, definitely, follow that. But if it's more for you and you're just like, oh, would I want to do this versus that? It's all about visually. It's kind of hard to do these do's and don'ts when it's all about visual preference. And we've all seen really great monochromatic flyers and posters, and then we've seen really great ones that are more traditional and clean. But it really comes down to making sure it's less is more, it's clean and easy to read. People are able to get specifically to your point and figure out what you're talking about. As far as the colors and the way they play with each other, you just want to make sure that it looks cohesive. You don't want to make sure your things are too bright, that like in the one with the blues, that things are blowing it out too much. Your yellows are way too bright and they're really kind of taking over, and it's really taking away from your subject matter. And you could even have that if you have a monochromatic. You could have one shade that's just really, really bold and it's taking away from the rest of your other colors. So it really is a personal preference if you wanted to jump on something like that, because it's kind of like the infographic. It was really popular, and it's something that's kind of not necessarily a traditional poster. It follows all the guidelines, but it's just definitely delivering it in a different form, as opposed to what most people think of. So it really depends on your style. It also depends on content. So say you're doing something that's very analytical and you have lots of things that you're measuring and outcomes. I wouldn't necessarily say, I would probably weigh more on a research style, because you have so much more to put out as opposed to a simple infographic like people come into the library and they come and do this. If you're really measuring a lot of how many people are coming in, what specific things are they checking out, what is our time in processing these checkouts, how can we, so it really depends also too on what you're presenting and what kind of topic it is. That marries on as far as what kind of format and difference of poster, and then also as far as colors too.
All right, thank you. And then we did actually have one more question come in, and we do have time for it. So can you provide any general rules of thumb for people in the audience seeing your slides regarding font color, knowing that there are attendees who may have color blindness or less than 20/20 vision? So are there any rules, such as maybe we shouldn't use red or gray fonts, etc.?
Yes, that's definitely a great thing to be aware of. A lot of times, definitely you just, because everyone, yes, so yes and yes. Yeah, you definitely want to make sure that even if, so say like even this bottom part is red, some people may view it even as a darkery gray. You just want to make sure that there's enough contrast from the font on top, the color of the font, in which you can read it if the shade were to change anything. So that's a lot harder when they're brighter, when the colors are much more brighter. The contrast seems to sometimes be harder when it changes. When they're a little more muted, when they start to, people who can't always see them, they'll start to change shades. The contrast doesn't change, as opposed to when the shade changes, because the tone will change, but the shade necessarily won't change. So it'll still be muted, but it'll be a muted tone of a different color, as opposed to the muted red. I hope that kind of answers that.
Yeah, I think that helps. So all right, that's all the questions that we've had for today. So thank you, Tiffany. And just a second, we're going to switch on to my screen. There we go. So we're so glad that all of you could be with us, and you will soon receive a short online evaluation form. If you could please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable and do help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording, and you now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. I'd like to again thank our presenter, Tiffany Davis, and thanks also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Iping Chengafi and Joseph Olivares, and to Megan Doherty from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. We have 8 more webinars this fall, the next one being on solutions for copyright issues in e-learning on October 4th. Please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will begin on October 24th, discussing the ins and outs of journal collection development. You can check the website for more information on upcoming courses and discussions. And thank you all for joining us today. This will conclude our session.